Hello everyone out there. My name is Tom Dodge. I'd love to welcome you to our video podcast, Creating the World We Want. I'm here with my co-host Bob Massey, and we're here welcoming Reverend Vernon K. Walker to our show as our sixth guest. It's really exciting because our objective here is to dive into the underlying issues that aren't necessarily addressed in today's media, and we want to be able to articulate and strive towards these goals so we can build towards the world we want together. Bob?
Well, I am super excited to have the Reverend Walker here today. He's a very dear friend. He is a leader in this community, and I'm going to go ahead and say, and a rising leader who's got a huge amount to offer. He's already done an extraordinary number of things. He graduated from Penn State. He came up to Boston University to do theology graduate studies, as did Dr. King, and he also did additional work in social work. He's been deeply involved in community organizing, working with the homeless and many other projects. More recently, he was a key organizer for the Nurses Ballot Initiative, something that should have passed. And he is one of the leaders of the Poor People's Campaign, which is a national movement that here in Boston and Massachusetts has already had a big impact. And more recently, he is just been elected to be the policy director of the Young Democrats of Massachusetts, and he is working with 350.org as program manager of CREW, which is a new program that CREW stands for Communities Responding to Extreme Weather. And this connection between focusing on economic injustice while at the same time getting ready and making the changes to face climate change is a critical juncture, something that Vernon has understood for a long time. We're seeing articulated in the New Deal, Green New Deal, and so many other areas. So Vernon, it really is an honor to have my friend here and to share your many insights into what we need to be thinking about as we try to create the world we want. I'd like to start with hearing about your background. I mean, obviously you're a man of deep commitments. Tell us about where you grew up and how the experiences shaped the formation of your strong values and your leadership.
Oh, sure, absolutely. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to Tom and to you, Bob. Having an opportunity to get to know you more and more over this last year, as well as Tom, seeing Tom around and the production team. So I'm so honored and so glad and so elated to be here on this wonderful, beautiful morning. So essentially, I grew up in Philadelphia, West Philadelphia. And while growing up, I grew up in a marginalized neighborhood, but while growing up, I didn't know it was marginalized. So this part of Philadelphia is comprised of row homes, and unlike Boston doesn't have anything similar where there's a neighborhood that is a majority of row homes. So I grew up in a single parent household with my sister, my older sister, and my dad was around, and although it was a single parent household that I grew up in, my father was a financial contributor, and when I needed to find him in North Philadelphia, I would go to his business. He had a tavern, or in Philadelphia term, we like to call it a bar. He had a bar, and I would go there to pick up weekly allowances. So although he wasn't physically present every day, anytime I needed to reach out to him or anytime I needed to get a hold of him, he was accessible, and he always left an open door. Kind of like Motel 6. He always left the light on for me. So that was a good, the light of the light of welcoming, the light of friendship, the light of mentorship. So essentially, growing up, in this in West Philadelphia, I began to figure out that the dilapidation that I was experiencing in terms of abandoned row homes, or that I was seeing. Abandoned row homes and unoccupied row homes and people dibbling and dabbling in mischievous activities, I thought those things were normal. It wasn't until later on that I began to realize that those things weren't normal. Because when you grow up in a neighborhood, and you grow up in a neighborhood, inner city, and and all you see around you is dilapidation, drug dealing, illicit behavior, racial profiling. That's all the police stop people many of times in my community. You began to get a sense that this is normalized. You began to get a sense that, oh, this is how it's supposed to be.
And there were some big, shocking events in your neighborhood, both before you were born and afterwards, you might want to tell us about.
Oh, absolutely. So what led to this mistrust between the community of color that I grew up in and the police was the bomb, which happened in 1985. The city of Philadelphia, or state troopers actually, the city of Philadelphia authorized state troopers to drop a bomb in the middle of the city. That's where Philadelphia gained its reputation as a city that bombs itself. And the mayor at the time, Wilson Goode, authorized it. And it was very shocking and horrifying. And
what was happening so that they made that horrible decision? What was going on?
Well, so this was, so the MOVE was a group, a black Pan-African, black liberationist group. And they occupied an entire street block. So imagine homes that are right next to each other, row homes. They occupied it, and they said that, we're going to create our own community. So essentially you had at various times, and this was a year before I was born, you had at various times people walking around naked. And the founder was a student at University of Penn, sociologist student at the University of Penn, and he wanted to create this Back to Africa, Pan-Africanist movement. So right in a section of West Philadelphia, not too far from where I grew up, the address was on Osage Street, 59th and Osage, I believe it was. They occupied this street for years, and the police had been negotiating with them to try to get them to integrate back into society, integrate back into normalized, quote unquote, normalized structures of society. And essentially they refused to do it. So in 1985, Mayor Wilson Goode authorized the state troopers to drop a bomb from a helicopter. And unfortunately, children died. 5 children died, 11 people total, and 65 homes were destroyed. This is an outrage, and this is atrocious. It's unjust, and no citizen should have to face the parallels from their own government. Dr. King knew all too well about facing the parallels from your own government. So essentially, this led to this continued mistrust that this particular community of color had with police. And essentially, this is this is the context I was born. I was raised about 15 to 20 minutes, depending on traffic, from where the move happened. And I was always interested, and it wasn't until I became an adult now that I reflected, but I was always interested when the police cruisers would come around, people would get very defensive. Not necessarily in my household, but my neighbors and my neighbors' neighbors and my neighbor's cousin and cousins and families and brothers and sisters, because I grew up in a housing development named Mill Creek. And another monumental event that of epic proportion that shaped the way that police looked at, the way that the community looked at the police was the event that happened in 2000 known as the Lex Street Massacre.
Lex Street Massacre, huh?
Yes, the Lex Street Massacre.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah, so it was a massacre where 10 people were shot in a crack house. And this happened 5 minutes from where I lived. I remember that night hearing gunshots, but I wasn't quite able to connect the dots. I was 14 at the time. And this was at the end of December, because traditionally, unlike in Boston, when the new year comes in, or right around the time it gets to the new year is approaching, people start shooting. People start pulling out guns and shooting to celebrate the new year. I think it's
Into the air?
into the air, yeah, just shooting bullets in the air. And quite a few people became casualties over the years. Because bullets have sometimes landed in went through people's windows, even though we're shooting up in the air. So it's very dangerous, a very dangerous practice, and very dangerous.
And what happened in this crack house? Was it, how did and why did these people die?
Yes, so it all started over a bad car deal. So let's say person A and person B. Person A sells person B a Dodge Intrepid. But person A doesn't tell person B that there are pre-existing problems. So person B purchases the car thinking it's all smooth and well, and about a week or two later, the cars start experiencing trouble where it wouldn't run anymore. So person B goes back to person A, say, hey, paraphrasing essentially, oh, you sold me a bad car, I want my money back. And person A said, well, no, that's not going to happen. That's your problem. So as a form of retaliation, just by the way, both were street pharmacists, drug dealers, selling crack cocaine and perhaps even selling marijuana as well. So essentially, person B knows where person A setup is. So person B gets a few other of his comrades, and they go in, and while people were dealing and wheeling, dealing and selling drugs, person B and his comrades, they shoot this crew. They shoot 10 people that were in the house. Seven unfortunately died, including one individual who's a contemporary of mine. I knew him. We had middle school classes together. We played basketball together. Malik Harris is his name. And unfortunately, he got caught up hanging out with the wrong crowd, doing the wrong type of things. So essentially, on Lex Street, right around the corner from the Mill Creek housing project, on that night, 7 people died, 3 played dead. And it was a firestorm that followed because the police chief and the mayor all declared that the violence has reached epic proportions and violence is spinning out of control. And at the time, the city councilor was Janie Blackwell. So essentially, what the city's response is to move. And what also makes this situation even more deep is that the city arrested the 4 gentlemen or they believe the 4 gentlemen that perpetrated the crime. They set in prison, and then some new evidence came out that they were wrongfully convicted, set in prison for 3 years until 2004. And essentially what happened, brothers, is they were exonerated. The city caught the real culprits, locked them up, and the men who were exonerated sued the city, I think for a collective settlement of $1 million. But essentially, the city's response to Lex Street, to the violence spiraling out of control in the Mill Creek projects, was to shut it down. So they offered folks Section 8 vouchers to move to different parts of the city. So they shut the housing projects down, and it shut down for quite a few years, and then they rebuilt new homes. And yes.
Well, we have so much to talk about that.
Yes.
And growing up in that environment, I'm just wondering, did you sometimes feel yourself drawn to go down that wrong road yourself? And instead, you had a revival, renewal, transformation of your faith, and it took you in a different direction. So could you tell us about that choice and that transformation, and about how you committed to an entirely different path?
Yes. So essentially, I didn't spend my entire, obviously, I didn't spend my entire life in West Philadelphia. So when the housing project shut down, we transitioned over to South Philadelphia. And this is predominantly at the time, 2001, this was predominantly a neighborhood of Italian brothers and sisters. So this provided a new pathway for me to kind of get away from the blight, get away from the crime, because the neighborhood that we moved into, me, my mom, and sister moved to in South Philadelphia was a little bit more cleaner. There were homeowners, so folks who had an invested interest in keeping the community in decent shape. So it wasn't just predominantly renters; it was homeowners and renters. So essentially, I spent most of my high school time in South Philadelphia, and then at the age of 18 we moved to North Philadelphia. And it was then that this pivotal moment to faith happened. My come to Jesus moment happened. I essentially moved down the street from a church named Deliverance Evangelistic Church. It's a big, nice sized church, the old Connie Mack Stadium in North Philadelphia. And I began to visit. I had some cousins who were encouraging me to visit. These were cousins that I wasn't quite close to, but they had gotten word that I moved to North Philadelphia, 21st in Indiana, and they said, "Well, won't you come on by?" And I said, "Well, let me try this here. Let me try to see what this big mega building is about, because it's literally shaped like a stadium." And that's what, and the Connie Mack Stadium is where the Negro League played, the Philadelphia baseball team Negro League, which was consequently right across from my high school, Dobbin Vocational Tech High School. That's where I went to high school at. So essentially, I started to visit, and a change began to happen, a metamorphosis, so to speak. But I wasn't quite aware of it. I began to listen intently, because growing up, listen intently to the preached message and to the sermon as the pastor would preach these sermons, because prior to that, I wasn't involved in a church-going family. Church-going was not on agenda Sunday morning, but playing basketball, eating pancakes, and hanging out was my agenda for most of my growing up Sunday mornings. Maybe hear a little gospel song on the radio or whatnot, or things of that nature. But essentially, I started to visit. And this is where God was wooing me. And then I picked up a book. It was by Mason Betha. He was a rapper who turned pastor. I think it was called The Revelations of Mason Betha. So this is in 2004. And I read how he had come to faith. And this was while the whole process, while God was wooing me to the faith, that I began to understand a little bit more as I began to attend more and more. And eventually, I started taking a new members class. So I'd come to the altar, and in that particular church, they invite people to come to the altar that want to take on a new leaf, that want to try something different, that wants to accept Jesus into their heart for a new perspective on life. So essentially, the one Sunday morning, the message was so moving and so poignant that what I didn't know at the time, but the Spirit of the Lord was drawing me to the altar. And it was that altar that I had a great exchange, but little did I know about the great exchange. This exchange was exchanging beauty for ashes, a sadness for gladness, the oil of the joy, and the oil of the joy for the moment, and joy that has endured over time to this point.
So how did that kind of inspire and lead to your community organizing passion?
Even before we get there, which is an excellent question, I just want to respond with a brief story. When I grew up in a family that wasn't particularly interested in going to church, so we had similar things. I was living overseas, but one of my acts of teen rebellion was to go to church from time to time, to get a peace and quiet, to do something I knew my parents didn't totally understand. And that process started to open me up and to think that a lot of the things I'd learned about Christianity, about Jesus, that he was a really nice guy in a nightgown who went around and only said that he, I realized that this was a much more challenging and much more filled with passion and beauty and so forth. And that set me up a number of years later to have a kind of, I considered myself a Christian before, but to experience a just overwhelming sensation of God's grace and forgiveness.
Yes.
And that stayed with me ever since. And it's funny because I wasn't necessarily looking for it. I was a seeker. But at the right moment, when I was about 20, 21, it came over me, and it's guided me ever since, in the sense that I have been deeply committed to justice and aware of my own failure to achieve those goals, and aware that despite those failures, I'm invited to keep going. So it's a dynamic. And I just wanted to mention that because, in a sense, Vernon and I think, experienced something similar that then brought us into a passion for organizing and justice. So I was listening and thinking, oh my gosh, I really identify. I think it's one of the reasons you and I have become such good friends.